Thank you, Katrina. You are a real champion. And to have people like you and Kristen and for you to throw yourself into service of others and then do such an incredible thing, but then it does so much good to you more than you have given to others. It's a special experience, isn't it? Kristen is not here. She would have had probably so much to tell you as well, but somehow Katrina represented her. Well, on the heels of medical missionaries, we came and PNG For Christ started. I had no idea what I was getting into. All I know was that last year I received an email where the conference president asked if I was interested in going and being part of PNG For Christ, not knowing really what that means and what that entails, how big it is, etc. So I just put up my hand, and when 24th of April came, I went. But before I tell you the story and testimony, let me share this text with you, and that's from the book of Acts, chapter 14, verse 27. And this is Paul speaking. You see, Paul had a mother church, his local church. The church in Antioch was the base church for Apostle Paul. But because he was a missionary, he would go through Asia Minor, and he would go on a journey, and he would always come back to the base. And then the Bible says that he would share the story. And look how the Bible puts it in the book of Acts. On arriving there, they gathered church together and reported all that God had done through them and how he opened a door of faith. There's something special about that. There's something special about hearing what God is doing. Because what I'm going to share with you is going to be God's work. Really, we can say, well, there's a missionary work, there is pastors and preachers and elders doing the PNG For Christ. But I was so convinced after everything was finished that this was really God's work. He orchestrated, he was part and parcel of it, his signature was all over it, and you at the end humbly recognize and admit this is from the beginning to an end the work of God. I love the text where Jesus said, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached until the end of the earth, and then the end will come. One of the important remarks that the president of Morabee Mission, where I was, said to all of us preachers who were about to start the mission was this. He said, you preachers came here to us, to Papua New Guinea, and in the words of Jesus, you came to the ends of the world, and in a way we are. And by the way, did you know that the first missionaries who went to Papua New Guinea, there was no success in Papua New Guinea for 30 years. 30 years. None. Not a single baptism. Not a single follower of Jesus for 30 years. But how story changed for that country, and I pray that the story will change in this country. God has done mighty things in the country of Papua New Guinea. And especially for us who came from Australia, and there was around 200 of us, at the back of our mind, as we were sharing the gospel in PNG, at the back of our mind was always, but what about Australia? And we always, and still think that Australia is still a tough nut to crack. But we'll talk about that at the end. Let me share this text before I tell you the story. I really believe that what just happened in PNG was a Pentecost Revisited, in a very real sense. Then the apostles returned to Jerusalem from the hill called the Mount of Olives, a Sabbath day's walk from the city. They all joined together constantly in prayer, along with women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with the brothers. Remember the context. Jesus gloriously resurrected from the dead. He died for the world, provided salvation, and now his disciples were living in the shadow of a new era and of a new reality. That they now know personally the Messiah, they know Savior personally, and they are now under the burden of sharing the good news in Jerusalem, in Samaria, and throughout the world. But Jesus told them, hey, stay in this upper room until the promise of the Father comes. And when that happens, you will start testifying about the Savior of the world. And when the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly a sound like a blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. And then you know the rest of the story. Peter was the one who stood up in the city of Jerusalem near the temple where masses of people were and started preaching. Already among the people, the story of Jesus was alive. But Peter connected all the dots needed in the minds and hearts of the people about Jesus. Everything made such a perfect sense. And that day, Bible says, that 3,000 people became Christians. And then daily God was adding to it. Nothing explains for the explosion of Christianity except for the fact that Jesus rose again after being in the grave for 3 days. And that he came for that reason. And that reason was that he would die for the sins of the world. That he would rise again. And he would launch the gospel. And it would be preached throughout the world. And then the end would come and he would come and take us back to himself. Which reminds me what happened when I was preaching in one of the sites. And it just came to me at the moment when I was preaching in Lay. And we were talking about the second coming of Jesus. And I would repeat that quite a few times. I said, when that happens, when Jesus comes again, I will lift off in Brisbane, you will lift off in Lay, and then we are going to meet in the clouds once again. When I said that, 10,000 people were just clapping. What an experience. But what I'm going to tell you now is a little bit about the trip and truly God at work. God at work. What happened? What were the outcomes of God's work? And where are we in all of this? Let me start with this one. This is one of the biggest takeaways that I have from this trip. I have never, I can tell you my age now, and I grew up in Adventist church. I have never ever seen church so united in the mission for God like Papua New Guinea. I've never seen that. And when I say that, I mean really from the top of the leadership of a church and all the way to every single member of a church. Everybody united. When I say every single person, I can't say that really, but I can say that every single church was involved. Can you imagine? President, union office staff, mission office staff, every single church, everybody united in a single-mindedly to reach out to people for Christ. I've never seen that. I've seen endeavors, maybe there are places in Brazil, I don't know, or somewhere in Africa, I don't know, maybe. But I'm telling you, I have never seen this. I live in Europe, this never happened in Europe. but what I've seen was pretty amazing. 2,300 sites across the country involved in PNG For Christ. A little bit of a trip. We left on the 24th of April. It was Wednesday. And that was a little shock. Many pastors from all around Australia gathered at the airport in Brisbane. And I was shocked to see there was about 40 pastors. Later on, I realized that there's about 200 from Australia, and there were a number of them who came from all around South Pacific, and as well as internationally. There were about three division presidents, number of conference presidents, quite a few secretaries. So this was big, bigger than Ben-Hur. And obviously there was a that's not funny. And there was obviously a general conference president who was there. What I really liked about Pastor Ted Wilson being with us is that you see him as just an ordinary pastor who is preaching the gospel to the people. I loved seeing that. So we gathered there at the airport. There you see our union president, Pastor Terry Johnson. This guy, his name is Alexei. He's not a pastor. He is an elder of his church. He comes from Moscow. He paid his own ticket. He's actually a pilot. And he came as an elder of a church and he preached in one of the sites. Amazing, yeah? So our journey began on 24th. We landed in Port Moresby. From Port Moresby, we went to Lae. Lae is the second biggest city of Papua New Guinea. Very important town as it really supplies much of the country, as that is the second largest port in Papua New Guinea, and it has about 300,000 people. Let me tell you, Lae is a rainy place. And this was one of those rare days when you can see a bit of a break in a cloud. It was a beautiful sunset, and I thought that's Lae, but really that's not Lae. Lae is just rainy. Very, very rainy place. But I'll tell you why I'm mentioning that later on. Pastor Kuamorobe Mission, president of Lae, met us with his team and welcomed us. And these are the people who were the preachers in the city of Lae. And they're international speakers, most of them from Australia, but also around South Pacific Division. Altogether 28. So there were 28 of us in the city of 250 to 300,000 people. There we are, just driving to a place where we would stay, and there you see in the middle the oldest preacher. I don't know if any of you recognize him. That's Pastor Calvin Townend. He's 80-something. And he was basically returning to Lae. As a young pastor, he was, that was his town. His kids were born there and went through primary school education in the city of Lae. And he was happy as Larry. He so was beaming coming back to Lae. It was so good to see him. So we found our lodging. I can honestly tell you we were so blessed. I was not going to say lucky, but blessed. Because just across the road from the place where we were lodging was a union office. So the union office is not in Port Moresby, but in Lae. And we were treated like kings. Ladies were preparing food for us, so it was so good. It was so good. The following day, so that was Thursday, we were officially welcomed, and the ceremony was held on the main oval in the city of Lae. They made this again big as Ben-Hur. And I mean, pathfinders, church choirs. I said, what? why this? Why do you make such a big fuss? But you do. It's a beautiful part of a culture that I was so taken by. Quite amazing. So the launch happened, and we were about to start. This group that you see in front of you is the group that was taking care of the site where the gospel was preached, where I was, basically my site. It was 3 Mile, 4 Mile, and 5 Mile, and Kamok Church. The people that you see there are members of those 3 churches. And now imagine that every single church across the whole country was doing exactly the same thing. So pastor would come, he would be part of this group that was so well organized. Everything was so well organized from start to finish. When I came, they told me the program. Everyone was involved. They built quite a sizable stage, and presentations would happen on the Oval. The Oval can sit up to 15,000 people. And all across this city of Leh, you had these ovals. And that's where the evangelism was taking place. So there was the official welcome at the 4 Mile where I was to start preaching the gospel. And that was the opening song at 4 Mile site. And this is a combined choir of 3 churches. And it was just, sun was setting, and we were starting PNG For Christ at 4 Mile site. And as I was sitting there at the stage, people were coming from all around the place. And that night we had about 3,000 to 4,000 people that came. It already was dark, and I was quite nervous because I have never preached in front of such a big crowd. Now, let me share with you about God at work now. Through the Word. Because ultimately, what we were going to do is share the Word. Medical missionaries have done their thing. Now was the time to share the Word and the gospel of Jesus with the people. What I really believe that we as Seventh-day Adventist Church have is something very precious, and that is to share the story. You can call that story in many different ways. You can call it a meta story, the story above every other story that is out there. We call it also the story of salvation, where you start from the beginning, how things were going well in the universe, but something happened with the rebel angel known as Lucifer. And then the story develops after he did what he did, when God created planet Earth and said to our parents, hey, don't join the alternative government in the universe. If you do, you will pay the price. And the humanity will pay the price. And we know what happened. Our first parents did what they did. So the story that started well, and then it had tragic part to it, both in heaven and down on earth, expects a hero would arise. And a hero was promised. So basically, as Adventists, we have this meta story, and all our stories are intersecting with the large story of the gospel. And what I was there as the minister of the gospel is to share the stories, the main stories of the gospel, starting chronologically from the beginning all the way to the end. And people resonated. I said to the people, and it resonates with us today, Hollywood will never grow broke. The reason why, because Hollywood is all about stories. But if it is a good story has exactly the elements that I mentioned. Things start well, tragedy hits. I can't handle it. We need a hero. Hero comes, resolves the problem, and then after he resolves the problem, we live happily ever after. That's repeated in your story, in my story, but the story above every other story is the story of salvation. So everybody can resonate with the story of the gospel. So as I did share the story of the gospel, and as church, we always need to remember that that's where our strength is, and that is to connect all the major episodes of the salvation story that we need to share with people, going all the way from when the rebellion happened all the way to the New Jerusalem. That's an amazing story, and people do resonate. We had people who came from different churches to attend, because it seems to me that many other churches do not connect the story fully and properly and deeply enough so that it fully resonates with others. We had a Baptist church members who would come every night, and pastor would come on Sunday, and nobody was in his church. Everybody was attending. So there is something to share. There's something to share. One of the things, I'll tell you some of the one-liners that I shared with them at that time. And that was when I spoke about the second coming of Jesus. I said, look, I'm going to lift off in Brisbane, and you're going to lift off in Lae, and we are going to meet up in the air. And you should have heard the clapping of 10,000 people. That was just something very, very special. Another thing where I saw God so at work was the weather was so finely tuned. You've heard from Miske, from Katrina, how the weather was finely tuned. This was amazing. I'll tell you about that, but let me tell you a couple of other things. Crime rate dropped almost altogether in the city. I'll tell you about that. Communities that were at war with one another reconciled with one another. God at work again. Attendance was just constantly climbing. God at work again. Baptisms, that's a story for itself, and we'll talk about that too. So let me talk about this God finally tuning the weather. As I said to you, it rains every day, just every day. But as you know, weather is unpredictable when it's going to rain. But what would happen during these 16 days in Lae? It would rain in the morning. By midday, it would stop. The ground would get kind of drier. And by nighttime, it would be fine. People come, exposed to the gospel, finish. They go home, it starts raining, then it rains again till about midday next day, and like that every day. And I said to them, is this how it happens every day? They said, no, it doesn't. And I said, wow, it's God's work all along. And I mentioned that to them, and everybody, the crowd was saying, yeah, this is God's signature all over it. God's signature all over it. Let me tell you about baptism. We had baptism for 3 Sabbaths. But again, I'm talking about weather now, not about baptism, okay? It would rain on Sabbath morning, but it was fine because it was little cooler because it's really humid. So when rain comes, it kind of freshens you. And because it's baptism, people are going into the water, coming out of the water. But as we were coming to the end of baptism, the sun would come, the rain would stop. It was just beautiful. And they were taking photos, congratulating each other. All of these 3 Sabbaths were exactly like that. Every Sabbath was like that. And you say, God, this can't be coincidence. This was just finely tuned. And we know that God is a designer, don't we? God is an amazing designer. Let me tell you about crime in Ley. The chief police officer for Ley told us that typically crime and disturbances in the city would pick up during weekend, especially Friday afternoon, Friday night, Saturday night. And he said during all this time, no phone calls. People were literally, well, 1/3 of the population was there, basically, physically present at these meetings. So crime really kind of fully dropped. Let me tell you about this one. There was a preacher, an elder of a church, who came to a site that was, and he did not know that this is the hardest, the most difficult community to be in. What happened some months prior to the beginning of the PNG of Christ, there was a dispute between the two communities that turned ugly. So much so that 48 people from one community were killed and houses burned. And then as a revenge, people from the other side of the road who belonged to the other community came, and as a revenge they killed 30-something people. So that was the community where this site was located and where this elder of a church from Brisbane was preaching. He had no idea that this was happening. And every night, there was some kind of murmur and disturbances at the edge of a camp. And he was never told because they were afraid that he was going to be too afraid to come. But the attendance was increasing. So from 3,000, it came all the way to 9,000 people at the end. The last Sabbath, something happened. Friday, a day before, the leaders of those two communities came to a pastor and said, "Pastor, we want to bring to an end these hostilities and we want to have a reconciliation ceremony." After the horrific thing that took place. And that Sabbath, last Sabbath, when they had about 300-something people baptized, they had a beautiful reconciliation ceremony. That's what the gospel does. That's what the gospel does. Increase in attendance. The first night, as I said to you, in my place, there was between 3,000 to 4,000 people. And third night, when gospel was shared, about 10,000 people were in attendance. That was amazing. Fourth night, I made a call for people to commit to Jesus through baptism. I put a number there, but I don't know. It could be that number, but that's just a third of a section of people, but there is way more that you can't see. In the middle of a week on Wednesday, that was the Wednesday before, we had a prayer session. And can you imagine 10,000 people being spread in small groups and where we were all praying? All three churches were organized in such a way that we had church members that were going to get to know people who were there and just ask them what are their needs for prayer. And just the whole site was just praying, just all praying. And again, God at work. The first Sabbath, 140 people baptized, and that had nothing to do with evangelism that I was conducting. It was these people were previously prepared. Those are the ones that were baptized. the pastor on the right-hand side, the older guy, he's 79 years old. He was baptizing. Imagine 100 and something people to baptize. It's quite a task. And the pastor on the other side, that's Pastor Enoch. And there they were. Second Sabbath, 149 people baptized. Okay, let me interrupt your thinking now. Because some of you might be thinking that these people, some of them might have been just dunked. Can I just tell you, stop thinking that way, because that's not true. Retention rate within Adventist Church in Australia is not as good in Australia as it is in Papua New Guinea. Even though they have also a backdoor problem that people go out of the church, that is a fact. That's true, but not as bad as in Australia. Although we had so many people who wanted to be baptized and they were exposed to the gospel almost in fullness, the leadership of those churches were very careful, and they would say to me, hey, you're not going to baptize many of them. They are not ready. They are not ready. And I fully submitted to their will and wish, because they know what they're doing. And so those people who, they were genuine people who accepted Jesus Christ and who wanted to fully commit their lives to God. It was only the last Sabbath when we had people who were baptized from the mission. And there are probably 3 times more that are still going to be baptized. And again, I see an amazing work of God. I was talking to them, to the pastor of a church, and he says to me, look, you may think that it is easy for us to find people and to preach the gospel. It's not easy for us. For us to have maybe 30, 40 people in a year to baptize, it's a big success. It's a big success. So what was happening here in PNG for Christ was unusual. That man that you see there, he's an elder of Lutheran Church. And this one, he's a mayor of Miles District. And we baptized him, and he gave a beautiful testimony that day. The one that you see on your left, Anglo-Saxon look, okay? That's Pastor Ben Ray. He's from Coffs Harbour. He was preaching in a prison, high security prison. For the first time in the history of PNG, they allowed somebody to come to high security prison to preach to the prisoners. That never happened. So they get a permission to go and do that. 150 prisoners were baptized. People also from the community were around, outside the prison walls, and they were also listening to the message. The person that you see, okay, on your left, behind Ben, that's a pastor of Pentecostal church. Him and the whole church became Adventists. And that's our boss, huh? So Pastor Ted Wilson was there. He came to lay. And the biggest thing for me was that I saw him as a pastor who is sharing the gospel of Jesus with others. And he had his own site, and it was so good to see that. He had his 75th birthday. We sang a happy birthday to him and had a lunch with him. This man here, and I'm finishing soon, is Roy. He's from the Union Office, and he was collating a live data that was coming from all around Papua New Guinea about in terms of attendance, children, youth, adults, baptisms, and every day he would come to give us an update. Now, let me give you the latest statistics and take a photo of this. Here it is. Approximately 3 million people attended PNG For Christ. Physically, okay, 3 million people. Out of 9 million people in Papua New Guinea, 3 million attended. That's historical. 52% of the 2,300 sites in PNG have reported their baptisms, 278,369, potentially around 500,000 people were baptized in PNG For Christ. And that's just the beginning. Adventists have become now the largest segment of population, potentially, than any other in Papua New Guinea. Now here is a question. For me, this is Pentecost Revisited, and the question I ask, if God did it in PNG, can he do it in Australia? Look, that was a question that was at the back of our minds for all the preachers who were there, because we know that Australia is a hard nut to crack. And none of us were just being silly and naive to think that it's easy. And none of us, even though we were experiencing what we were experiencing and thinking in the back of our mind where we come from, none of us dared to think that this could be done in Australia. Do you follow me? But as I came back, I just started thinking more and more. Why not? Why not? Is it possible that something happened in our Western culture? And I really believe it has happened. The soul of a Western culture is kind of irrevocably damaged, as Christianity has been totally shunned. And the culture and the leaders of culture are taking us who knows where. And it's truly become a Babylon out there. Do you agree with that? Something about the soul of the Western culture is irrevocably damaged. And so many people understand that. And so many people, therefore, are turning to Jesus. Turning to Jesus. Did God maybe use PNG in such a big way, the ends of the world, to start something in other countries that can be also strike a chord even in as secular society as is ours? So we can call it Australia for Christ. Let's see. Because at the end of the day, it's not our work, it's God at work. And we will be meeting. The beautiful thing about this is that at least 200 pastors from Australia, including presidents of all sorts, were there. And this was a common experience to all of us. And we are going to meet and have a bit of our debrief and potentially start thinking and have a bit of a larger vision in all of this. So pray that there is such an event like Australia for Christ. Amen.